morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy to talk about today mission-critical agility, which is what I'm calling a way of thinking about risk-taking and vision that applies even when the consequences can be quite serious. I'm going to tell you 3 stories today. And I think the reason why I'm going to be telling stories today is that agile thinking has become something of a buzzword, I'm afraid. There are hundreds of books written about this. There are movies about it. And I have a confession to make. I didn't write any of those books or make any of those movies. But these stories that I'm going to tell have taught me more about thinking this way and working this way than all those books combined. And I think they're a heck of a lot more interesting, too. So I should give you another quick caveat, which is that I like to tell stories in a bit of a different way. I like to bring out a lot of fun toys. And in fact, you guys today are going to be the very first people to see this one. It's just been finished. And that also means it's almost certainly going to glitch on me at least once. But this talk is about risk, right? So I figure I should take a few. So anyway, I'm going to begin with a story that is about the birth of the internet. Only my story is not going to begin with Tim Berners-Lee or Vint Cerf or any of those giants. It's going to start a little bit earlier than that. It's because I've got to go a little bit earlier, I think, to tell you about these essential qualities of vision, which I believe is one of the 2 or 3 main pillars of agile thinking, and 2 of the stories I'm going to be focusing on today. So my story begins with a monk, which is a little strange, I admit, but he's standing in Paris in a field in 1490-something. He's happy to be out of his monastery, standing on this beautiful day. But he's also a little bit confused. He's confused because he's been asked to leave his studies and come away and stand in the middle of this field with a bunch of his closest associates, the other monks at his monastery. Now, he hasn't asked too many questions yet, but he's getting a little bit uncomfortable by the fact that he's been asked to hold these 2 very heavy iron wires very tightly in both hands. And on the other end of each of these wires is another monk, another friend from his monastery. And they make a huge loop around this field, forming almost a monk network. And he gets a little more nervous by the fact that his boss, the abbot Jean-Antoine Nollet, who is at the beginning and the end of that loop of monks and wires, is now holding these 2 wires up over these ominous-looking jars, his wires, the ends of the monk network. And he's about to ask a question when, bam, shock, and everyone screams all at the same time. Because what he doesn't realize is that he has become an unwitting participant in one of the earliest experiments of electricity. And Jean-Antoine Nollet has discovered some very important things. First, that electricity travels very quickly because everybody jumped at the same time. And second, that it might be useful for communication. Okay, and maybe third, that if you're in a pinch, a monk makes a good voltage detector. But so it was going to be a little while before those early experiments of electricity and the efforts of people like Carl Gauss and Baron Schilling would ultimately bring about a practical electronic communication device. And that would be due to the invention of this gentleman, Samuel Morse. Now, he's not the only one who was working on a telegraph, and that'll be a common theme in this presentation. But he's the first one who came up with the first commercially successful one. And when he held his invention for the first time in his hands and sent the first telegraph message, the words he used were, "What hath God wrought?" And I think then he knew something very big was coming. Now, he probably didn't have YouTube and silly cat videos in mind, but nonetheless, I will point out that we're still sending telegraphs today. We're texting and instant messaging little 140-character blips to the world. So, although the telegraph may seem quaint by now, it's still with us now. Now, the telegraph was an amazing invention for the time, but it had a serious problem. It had a monopoly to begin with. The Western Union Telegraph Company completely controlled the telegraph industry in the United States, at least. But they knew they had a problem too, which is that the telegraph of the time could only send one message at a time on a wire. So forget bandwidth or anything approaching a modem or DSL. One message traveling on a wire in either direction at a time. This is an incredible limitation. Now, they had a hunch that this wasn't a true barrier, that it might be possible to create this amazing idea of a multiple telegraph. That was a visionary thought in its own way. And we'll come to in a moment why it wasn't the right vision at the time. But in order to try and achieve this, they started something of a little frenzy amongst inventors. They made it known that if anyone could bring to them a multiple telegraph, that they would richly reward them. And so a great number of people were swept up in this invention craze, including the hero of our first story this morning, Alexander Graham Bell, who, of course, is known as, popularly, the inventor of at least the first commercially successful telephone. But he didn't start there. He started, actually, as a poor immigrant from Scotland. And I know you might have the idea of Alexander Graham Bell as being a well-to-do aristocrat experimenting in a building on his grounds, trying to find out how to make the telephone work. That's not him. Dirt poor, working very hard just to find enough food to eat to get by. He was not the likely winner of this contest to invent the multiple telegraph. It's something of a dark horse because he had competition of the likes of these gentlemen, Thomas Edison, Elisha Gray. Thomas Edison, by this point, already well on his way to being known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. Elisha Gray, funded directly by the Western Union Telegraph Company. These are the guys who are supposed to win this race. Just a question of which one. However, Alexander Graham Bell had one thing that neither of them had, which was his father, Alexander Melville Bell, a scientist and inventor in his own right. Now, what he had invented was this, visible speech, which was a way for deaf people to learn how to speak. Now, he invented this in part because Alexander Graham Bell's mother, Alexander Melville Bell's wife, was deaf. And so hearing and a lack of hearing permeated the Bell household throughout Alexander's young life. And I think it is that knowledge and that experience, not electrical engineering, which Elisha Gray had, Thomas Edison with his vast experience in telegraphs, but the knowledge of sound and hearing that ultimately led to Alexander Graham Bell's greatest invention. But to get there, he needed money badly. That would come from this gentleman, Gardiner Hubbard. Now, Gardiner Hubbard had a problem too. He was a well-to-do businessman, and he wanted to build a telegraph company of his own. And as I just told you, the Western Union Telegraph Company had a monopoly. Starting a company in the presence of a monopoly, something maybe some of you can identify with, is a very challenging thing to accomplish. Now, Alexander Graham Bell met Gardiner through a very unlikely route, which is through his daughter, Mabel Bell. Alexander Graham Bell was making ends meet by teaching deaf people at a school in Boston. Mabel Bell was deaf. Gardiner Hubbard was surprised to learn that the teacher of his daughter had an interest in this multiple telegraph business and decided to fund him. Well, he didn't really have much choice because Western Union had already scooped up all the good inventors. So he had to go with this guy. Now, I've been a little bit tricky here, a little bit deceptive, which is that this is not actually what Mabel Bell looked like when Alexander Graham Bell met her. She looked a little bit more like this. And this would prove to be something of a complication. Now, the drama of these events of Alexander Graham Bell's life are played out in letters and telegraphs that have been faithfully preserved by the Library of Congress, thankfully. And on your behalf, I have poured through these letters, which, by the way, include handwriting that I would argue is basically encryption. This is one from Alexander Graham Bell to his parents. I'll just take a moment to digress. This is an amazing letter. This is a letter of him. Well, I'll come to it in just a moment. Give away the rest of our story. Now, there were a great many letters, and I've poured over these on your behalf and transcribed some of them so you don't have to try to read that scratch. Let's begin with letters from his father, Alexander Melville Bell. He is not pleased with the direction his son has taken. Because honestly, I think deep down what he really wanted his son to be focusing on was his invention, visible speech. He wanted Alexander Graham Bell to pick up his legacy and take it to the world. He certainly didn't approve about all this nonsense about multiple telegraphs, and this concept that his son had begun talking about, a telephone, was just silliness. He tells him that the best thing that he could do would be to sell out, to give his plans to his business partners, Gardiner Hubbard and this other fellow, Sanders, so that he can focus on what really matters, which is teaching and visible speech. Now, meanwhile, Gardiner Hubbard is equally displeased because he is jealous of every moment that Alexander spends on anything except the multiple telegraph. So when he's working on visible speech or when he starts talking about this nonsense of the telephone, he's getting furious because he's paying for him to do this work. He's the funder. He's the guy with the money. Now, I'm afraid that this drama takes a rather difficult change at this moment, which is that Mabel Bell even becomes a pawn in this discussion. Because by this point, Gardiner Hubbard has realized that Alexander Graham Bell is romantically interested in his daughter, something that he does not entirely approve of. Remember, Alexander Graham Bell, dirt poor immigrant, the Gardiner Hubbard family, well-to-do businessman. It comes to the point, and we know this from Mabel's letters, that Alexander is told by Gardiner, either drop everything except the multiple telegraph or you'll never see my daughter again. Now, I want you just to reflect for a moment on the intensity of the pressure that is felt by our hero, Alexander Graham Bell, in this moment. And this is why I chose this story to tell you, because it's in this moment that everyone is telling him to focus on anything other than the telephone. Focus on visible speech. Focus on the multiple telegraph. Focus on something to stop making my father so angry with you so that I can still see you. Now, what does Alexander Graham Bell do in this situation? What is he drawn to do by his vision but to create the telephone? And he does. And it's a marvelous invention. It will change the world, but not yet, because Alexander Graham Bell, while he possessed an amazing kind of vision, he lacked a different kind of vision. He lacked the vision of what to do with this amazing thing now that it was created. Now, there was an amazing opportunity for him, which was the Centennial Exposition, the World's Fair, which was occurring in Philadelphia right then. And in addition to, being a fair, it was a place where inventions were exhibited. This is a place where countries brought their greatest devices and achievements and exhibited them on display. Alexander Graham Bell can't even be bothered to bring his invention to the World's Fair. He was probably tired. He'd been working so hard, he'd practically worked himself to death on a couple of occasions. He was back to teaching. The telephone had been invented. It was working, but he couldn't go down to the fair to exhibit it. Now, this is where Mabel Hubbard intervenes in a way that shows a different kind of vision, because what she does, she secretly packs a bag for him, and she tells him at the beginning of the day, I'm going to come and meet you with a carriage after you're done teaching, and we're going to go for a ride in the country. He says, okay. So she picks him up, and before he knows it, he's standing at the train station holding his bag in one hand, a ticket in the other, and his fiancée at the time is walking away from him. Now, he protests, runs around, tells her, I can't go. I have to teach. This isn't what is important. And she says, stop. This is your opportunity. This is the moment. You must go to Philadelphia. turns her back, walks away. Now remember, she's deaf. And by turning her back, she reads lips. She is literally deaf to his complaints. What is he left to do but to climb dejectedly onto that train, to travel to the World's Fair, show his telephone to people, including the Emperor Don Pedro of Spain. It is an instant sensation. This is the moment when the telephone becomes the great accomplishment that we know today. Because it was Mabel Bell that understood that this was the moment that it could be brought to the world. Interestingly, this is a role she continued to play in the Bell Telephone Company for her entire life. And while we're on the subject of Mabel Bell, she also became one of the key pioneers in Canadian aviation. So Mabel Bell, who deserves a talk all on her own, a deaf woman, plays a critical role in the bringing of the telephone to the world and a pioneer in aviation. A remarkable story all on her own. Now, I've talked about a couple of kinds of vision. The first vision, that ability to know that something is possible, to know how to create that which is not, to understand the impact it could have on the world. That's Alexander Graham Bell's vision. And then Mabel Bell's vision of understanding how to bring it to the world at the right moment. I'm afraid now I must tell you a story of a complete lack of vision. So now where are we? We have a working telephone. It's patented. Here's a copy of the first page of that patent. Through, by the way, great legal challenge. Alexander Graham Bell and the Bell Telephone Company defended their patents in court 500 times. So if anyone in here feels that they have a patent struggle, I think they've got you beat. So the funder of all of this work, Gardiner Hubbard, at this moment gets a little bit of cold feet because he's not really sure that they can bring the product to market. So what does he do? He goes back to the Western Union Telegraph Company. Remember them? Monopoly of the telegraph industry? He comes in and he presents them with the patents and a working model of the telephone in the office of the president of Western Union. He offers to sell it for a sum that in today's dollars is $5 million. All of the rights to the telephone, forever, for $5 million. The Western Union Telegraph Company turned him down. The president, and now it's very difficult to know exactly what he said in that meeting, but he's commonly quoted as saying, William Orton, by the way, his name, "What use would my company have for this electrical toy?" And in saying so, I think, unfortunately, cemented his legacy as not the leader of one of the greatest companies of the 19th century, but as the man who made possibly the worst business decision in history. $5 million for the telephone. Wow. Now, we're drawing to the end of this first story. Two kinds of vision and one extreme lack of vision. I want to just take a moment to dwell on what was William Orton's problem. What did he not see? Because it is a blind spot that we all have. All of you, myself, people I work with. And that is illustrated this way. So I'm going to use actually the telephone because if you take the example of the Bell telephone right here, one of the first telephones ever made, and then look what happens over the next 100 years or so. The Bell Telephone Company makes advances in telephone headsets, but I want you to note the difference here. These are still spaced by about 20 years. Things have really started to slow down. What happened to the Bell Telephone Company? Why do we not talk about the Bell Telephone Company the way that it was in 1900? And that's because of Motorola. Because that happened. And I put those on separate lines for a reason. Because the kind of innovation you see going from left to right up there, that's the kind of innovation that the Western Union Telegraph Company was thinking about. We have a telegraph, let's build a multiple telegraph. That's clearly the logical thing to do. And by the way, it was an important invention, but they completely missed the telephone, which is fundamentally different, yet far more revolutionary in the end. Same thing happened here with the Bell Telephone Company. Ultimately, they missed cellular telephones. Now, Motorola, well, that's pretty impressive, right? They did the same thing. What ate their lunch? Smartphones, BlackBerries and iPhones. Now, when we look at that sentence along the bottom and we ask ourselves, what finishes that sentence? Please don't tell me that it's a white iPhone. And I, as a challenge for us all, ask, what is the next line on that screen? What is the next paragraph in the story, not the next sentence? We already know what the next sentence is. They're going to get a little smaller. They're going to get a little bit faster. That's not what is going to completely eat the lunch of Apple Computer, Nokia, these guys. Now, just to conclude our story about vision, you may be getting the feeling that Alexander Graham Bell is somehow superhuman, that the kind of vision that he has is just impossible to have today. That's not entirely true. And in fact, I'm going to tell a quick little vignette here to explain that he was laboring, to some extent, under a misconception, which is that Alexander Graham Bell, when he was younger, got a hold of a book by Helmholtz, who was a German scientist who had been working on electricity and some things on audio, but it was written in German. And Alexander Graham Bell didn't read German, but he looked at the diagrams and he thought he had things figured out. What he thought he had understood from Helmholtz's book is that Helmholtz had successfully sent the sound of a vowel over a wire. So, a part of speech, a vowel. And so Alexander Graham Bell read that and said, fantastic. Well, if he can do that, clearly all I have to do is figure out how to send consonants and I can send speech over a wire. Helmholtz had done nothing of the kind. He misunderstood the book. He mistranslated the words. And later, when he got a hold of a French translation of the book, which he could read, he realized that he'd been laboring to reproduce an experiment that had never been accomplished, which I find rather profound, because he says in his own writings that if he had known that Helmholtz had never done it, he probably would have never tried to invent the telephone. Which tells you that quite often the belief that something is possible is the greater part of vision. Something that certainly guided me. Now I'm going to conclude that story and go on to my next one. My next story is about risk. And I'm really happy actually to talk about risk with this audience, because this is a topic that you guys understand. We understand it at NASA as well. I work in a place where mistakes have critical consequences, sometimes life-critical consequences, sometimes multi-billion-dollar spacecraft being lost. It's possible to feel paralyzed about that, to just stop and freeze. This story is about how we can't do that, how we can't allow that. Now, at no point in NASA's history do I believe that the sense of risk was more keenly felt than in this one.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
I love listening to that. It's interesting. He kind of left out the part about how we were supposed to do it. Must be nice to be the president, right? You just bang your fist and say, we got to go do this, and then someone else has got to figure it out. And I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that that our nation's space agency, that NASA, had no idea how to do this when this announcement was being made. Now, where could they look for inspiration? How do you imagine how to do something which has never been done before? Now, I hate to say it, but from my research, it looks like they were inspired by things like this. So here's Destination Moon, 1958 or so, and it provides a very charming vision about how you would go to the moon. In fact, if you asked your 5-year-old, how would we go to the moon? They would probably say something like this. Well, Daddy, I would build a giant rocket. How big, honey? Oh, huge. And I would fly it to the moon, and I would land it on the moon, and then I would get out of the rocket, and then I would get back on the rocket, I would fly it back to Earth. Can I go play now? It's a compelling vision. It makes a certain kind of charming sense, and so it's not surprising, I suppose, that this was essentially the initial design for the Apollo mission, called the direct ascent method. And it basically consisted of building a giant rocket called the Nova. Even bigger, by the way, than the Saturn V, which we ultimately did use. And I just have to digress at this moment to mention that the Saturn V rocket, the rocket that ultimately took us to the moon, when it was launched, was the tallest building in Florida. Well, okay, technically the tallest building in Florida was the one that held the Saturn V. But the Saturn V, mind you, was rolled down a road and then launched into space. They launched the tallest building in Florida into space. It's amazing. This thing was going to be even bigger than that. And the thing is, it had to be huge. Just the part that landed on the moon was 6 stories tall. It was so big because it had to be everything. It was the craft that carried all of their consumables. It was the thing that launched, that took us to the moon, that launched us back. It did everything. You can think of it as sort of the Battlestar Galactica method of lunar exploration. It was huge. It was ponderous. It was ultimately too big to succeed. But on the cover, it seemed like a low-risk option. It seemed very understandable. It was even endorsed by some very influential people at NASA, including this gentleman, Wernher von Braun. He backed the direct ascent method. He said this was the way to do it. Now, there was a small vocal minority led by this gentleman, the hero of our second story, John Houbolt. And he proposed a very different vision. What he said is that we should instead build a multi-part reconfigurable spacecraft that would change its configuration several times in space on the way and back from the moon. And even by today's standards, this sounds like science fiction. I want you to imagine what it sounded like in 1960 when he explained it. 1962. Here he is explaining it. And he's using, I think, a remarkably low-risk system called a chalkboard. But I'm not going to explain the lunar orbit rendezvous method using a chalkboard. Because like I said, this talk's partly about risk. I don't think you'll take me seriously about risk if I don't take some risks. So I'm going to use a little bit of a different method. So, start with this. We've already ruled out the Battlestar Galactica method of travel. So let's go to the opposite extreme. What is the smallest thing that you could possibly cram 3 astronauts inside? And I think pretty much you would come up with, come on, there we go. This is the Apollo command module. It is an exercise in minimalism in spacecraft design. It has on it a single door, by the way, which you climb in one time and you climb out of one time, the second time on Earth. Inside it, you've got basically enough room to put 3 astronauts, but it's kind of missing an important part. I think you could agree that that's really not going anywhere. You're going to need something like an engine, perhaps. So let's bring in the second part, the service module. Now, the service module has a lot of important stuff in it. It's got consumables, it's got fuel tanks, it's got the engine on the back of it. But I don't want you to think all of a sudden that the astronauts have like a stretch limo accommodation here, because this thing docks right here on the back, but none of it's pressurized. So the astronauts are still crammed up there in the front. But now you got something that maybe your 5-year-old would have drawn. That thing looks like it could go somewhere. It, however, will not go to the surface of the moon. It's not going to accomplish that task for us. To go to the surface of the moon, we're going to need something like this. This is the Lunar Excursion module. Now, this is a true spacecraft. It has these tiny, spindly legs, all of these hard edges and corners. This thing would fold up and melt in Earth's atmosphere if it tried to land here. But it's really well designed for the moon and for low gravity. And what we do with it for launch is we dock it onto the back of the service module like that. This is the launch configuration for Apollo. So you can imagine the launch shroud sort of fitting over and around this thing. Now let's take just a moment and imagine how John Halbolt's presentation is going at about now, because the guy just before him said, we're going to go to the moon by building a giant rocket, flying to the moon, and bringing it back. Any questions? And then he starts explaining this. I bet you people started to look a little uncomfortable, and I wonder if somebody raised their hand and said, John, it's really great that you came out here and explained this to us, but that rocket engine part you were talking about here, me and the guys were talking, if you turn that on, we don't think it's going to be really good for this part over here. And John says, oh, no, well, after we launch, you see, we're going to undock this part and spin it around and redock it back to the craft like that in space. Well, they let him keep talking, and it's a darn good thing that they did, because this is the cruise configuration of the Apollo spacecraft. Now, if you'll permit me just a moment of theater here. Here we are at Earth in space. We've redocked, and now Earth recedes in the distance. Sound effects. And we arrive at the moon. Now, surely we're done with all the silliness, right? So, no, we're not. In fact, because now that we've arrived at the moon, we've already established that this part over here, I think, is not going to the surface of the moon. So, 2 astronauts climb from there into there, and one guy, by the way, gets to stay back here and do science, which you have to agree has to be kind of a little bit of a letdown. You're at the moon. Anyway, they undock. This part just goes off and hangs out in lunar orbit for a little while. But this sports car here, well, astronauts pilot this thing down to the surface and land it. By the way, just momentary anecdote. Really a huge fan of our astronauts. I'm who I am today because of the examples of astronauts. This is a funny little story about them. Every Apollo landing was accomplished manually. Now, the spacecraft was capable of landing itself. And in historical analyses, there was one pilot who did need to land manually. That was Neil Armstrong, because the location that the craft was coming down was not a safe landing location. But after Neil did that, you better believe those fighter jocks are not going to land automatically on the moon. So every one of them went manual at the last moments of landing. Anyway, they land this amazing thing on the moon. So here we are on the moon. They get out. They collect some rocks. They hit a couple golf balls. And then something rather astonishing happens, which is we break this spacecraft in half again. Come on now. There we go. And this part launches back into space again. And we leave this other part there on the ground. So this thing has to now go and find this poor guy who got left in orbit and redock back to it again. The 2 astronauts climb from here into there. How's it been up here? Kind of boring. We brought you some rocks. They're all in here. And by the way, they're about to separate this piece. And I bet there was a discussion here of like, okay, is everybody in this part of the spacecraft? Let's count. So like 1, 2, 3. No, wait. 1, 2, 3. Are we all in this? Because what they're about to do is detach this thing and send it spiraling down to the surface of the moon to make a huge hole in the moon for science. So I think they were careful about being on board. So here we are. Our spacecraft is rapidly shrinking. We now have this part, and only this part, and it's time to go home. More theater. Here we are at the moon. Back to the Earth again. Whoa, too close. Now, what happens now? It's time to re-enter, okay? So now the astronauts get to the instruction, I think a rather scary instruction, that guys, it's time to detach your rocket engine. Now, you are in space and someone tells you to drop your engine. This part. That was probably kind of a scary moment, right? They did. They detach this thing, it burns up in the atmosphere. And we are left with just this. From the largest building in Florida down to just this, what it does is re-enters the atmosphere, floats gently down on a parachute into the ocean, and 3 astronauts climb out, very thankful to be alive. The end. Now, let me bring that back. So, come on now. It's nervous about all the bright lights. I want to bring this all back for you, though, for 1 second. Because when I look at this, the first phrase that comes to my mind is not low risk. But with the benefit of a whole lot more science and a whole lot more time, scientific historians have been able to look back at this and tell us that this was the defining moment of Apollo. It is this design that most historians credit with getting us to the moon when we did, and possibly with getting us to the moon at all. It was not the obvious solution. It did not appear to be the lowest risk solution. It was, however, in the end, the simplest thing that could possibly work. So we're not quite done yet. I want to come back to that very point. Now, as I mentioned before, the opposing approach, the direct descent method, was backed by some very impressive people like this gentleman. This gentleman did a pretty interesting thing in this moment, though. He changed his mind. Wow, right? He studied the approach of the lunar orbit rendezvous and then admitted that he was wrong and endorsed the approach of John Houbolt publicly with appropriate credit. He did exactly the opposite of what William Orton did. And honestly, you have to respect this gentleman for doing that. To be that person that everyone is looking to and to back out your plan in favor of a subordinate's because you thought it was the right idea after all. Showed an amazing vision of his own and also an understanding of risk, which has permeated the agency to this day. Now, as I mentioned before, we are often told that the best way to avoid a risky situation is to do the simple thing, because simple things aren't risky, right? Wrong, okay? If you look at the way we landed the rover on Mars just this past August, there is nothing simple about the approach that we used. It succeeded not because of its simplicity, but because we had a keen appreciation for the fact that it was the simplest thing that could work. I think this, by the way, and Ward Cunningham, the guy who actually said this, is one of those guys who wrote all those agile books I mentioned earlier, so he really knows what he's talking about. This phrase, as I'm going to explain here in a moment, really has affected the way that I've worked at NASA. So I'm going to finish with one more story. This one's a more personal one. And it's about my recent work and how those kinds of stories that I just told changed the way that I approached my work at NASA. Now, my work at JPL is focused on mission control, mission command and control. And I lead the organization that's responsible for the people and the software and the processes that command 15 missions throughout the solar system. And that includes Mars rovers and deep space spacecraft and telescopes and really a broad menagerie of different kinds of devices. It's a risky business. It's a business that's required us to think very differently about how to do this, because we do this in an era of contracting budgets. My first experience at NASA taught me that although some of the movies may say otherwise, that in NASA, failure absolutely is an option at times. This is the Mars Polar Lander mission. And in 1999, it failed to land on Mars. This was my first mission at JPL. I was waiting excitedly because I had built the software that would control that craft once it landed. It was never used. I try to tell folks that, a typical mission at JPL takes at least 5-6 years to put together. So think of that as like a PhD of time spent. People work insane hours to try to get these missions done. Imagine if you had finished your PhD and you came up on stage at graduation to receive your diploma, and the guy who was about to give it to you said, oh, hold on one second, we're going to just roll these dice over here, and if they come up okay, you get your PhD. If not, you get nothing. And not only that, but people are going to accuse you of wasting money. So that's the kind of stakes. But the alternative is not to try at all. And so facing that right at the beginning of my career, I'm really happy that it didn't stop me, and it didn't stop a lot of other people that I worked with, and their examples inspired me to keep trying. And what came out of the ashes of that project, at least for me, was this. This is Fido, and no, that is not Mars. That is, I believe, we did so many trials. I think that one's Arizona, which, if you go there, looks sort of like Mars sometimes, but blue sky there is kind of a giveaway. But what we started imagining, but by the way, we failed to land a lander. So what are we going to do? We're going to try to do something simpler, something easier? No, we're going to send a rover, and not just a rover like the one that landed in '98, a rover that's going to drive over the horizon, that's going to be a true explorer on the surface of Mars. And we used Fido and vehicles like it to figure out how that was going to work, to try it out over and over again, to rehearse it as mock missions out in the desert. It probably looked like we were trying to fake a Mars mission out there sometimes, but we would go out in the desert and we would try software and mechanisms over and over again to try to figure out how we were going to do this, so that when the call came, could we build a rover? We were ready. Now, it wasn't too long after that NASA said, oh, wait, we changed our mind. Could you build two? So this became Spirit and Opportunity. And I found myself in the position of leading the science control system for these amazing vehicles. And I remember as we were building up the system to operate these vehicles, we came to launch day, and we were working furiously. And it's a funny thing. Launch is a big deal for us, sure. But for someone like myself who's primarily worried about what we're going to do when the thing gets there, it's a momentary stressful distraction. What we do is we get up and we run over to the television and watch the thing launch, and we're like, good, that didn't, nothing went wrong, so now it's really going to get there, we got to get back to work again. So it's a common, it's a little known fact, I guess, that we write a great deal of the software while the spacecraft is on the way to the other planet. We have to do that because that's how we save money. We do this on top of each other so that we're able to not have the team on earlier. So we went back to work writing the software for these things, not only looking now at a countdown clock to landing, but also at a distance clock, because those things go fast. When I watched these launches, I noticed something that has really become a metaphor for my work, and one that I think could be a metaphor for your work as well. I think, in fact, it's a metaphor for any great enterprise, any challenging task, which is this. When you look at these rockets, first of all, those are both the Delta II rockets, an amazing vehicle. I was telling somebody last night that these rockets have launched 150 times with only one failure. It was built by Boeing and then United Launch Alliance. They are incredible vehicles. They have a million little things that have got to go right. But all taken together, they're not the point of the mission. The point of the mission is not that rocket. The point of the mission is crammed into that tiny little white nose cone at the very, very top. All the rest of that is what we call the launch vehicle. So the top part is the payload, and the rest of it's the launch vehicle. Now, when you look, actually, at just, I don't know, any metric you want to use, the size of these things, the explosive power that's in that tank at the back, that launch vehicle deserves a lot of respect. What I noticed was that in the systems that we were building, you could also divide the work into launch vehicle and payload. And what that meant was there was the payload, which is the part we really cared about. It was it was our rocket science. And if you think about your rocket science, it's the thing that you do that sets you apart from your competitors. It's the thing that you daydream about. It's the thing you're actually being paid to do. It's the point of it all. And everything else is the launch vehicle. And when I looked at my system, I saw that we were really getting the payload done pretty well, but we were messing up on the launch vehicle for the systems that I was responsible for. And what that led us to do is to find partners, to find products that we could purchase, to find partners we could collaborate with that understood the launch vehicle part. So we found people, for instance, that knew how to build highly usable applications that could update themselves, that could share data efficiently, things that all applications have to do, things that do not set me apart from anybody else. And we partnered with them to let them do that part. And it led us to actually change the way we thought about building systems, because I'm afraid in my business, and I imagine in many businesses, this is usually the first question people ask when they're given a challenge. Here's some money, here's some requirements. How do I build this? How do I make this? How do we internally create this? This observation of launch vehicle and payload has led my teams now to always ask this question, which might seem like you're shirking your duty right off the bat, but it's not. What it means is there any way that I can hold back my critical investment, the part that I am supposed to spend on my rocket science, by trusting someone else and working with someone else to do this other part? And the reason why that often is a good way to reduce risk is that for them, their rocket science is the launch vehicle. That is the part that they daydream about. That is the part that they have made their life's career. So when you partner with them, you're getting not just a little bit of work off your plate, you're getting their expertise, which vastly exceeds yours in that particular area. And so I learned a lot of respect for people who knew how to build those kinds of systems, and that is what guided the development of the system that is controlling the Curiosity rover today. Now, I want to move forward in this story just a little bit. So I watched launch, watched those rockets go off, and then furiously went back and worked like mad to try to get the software done in time to control it when it landed, which is a little crazy, but it brings me to this moment. One of the scariest moments of my entire career, sitting in the operations center at JPL. The spacecraft has landed successfully already. So that was a big relief. But now it's time to control it. And I'm sitting right there. And the room is full of scientists who have spent, some of them upwards of a decade of their life, preparing the instruments and the scientific plan that brought us to this moment. We're about to receive the first images from Mars, and I'm about to open them in the software that I led. And sure, I'm thinking about, what might we see? What's going to be the first view that we have of Mars? But mostly what I'm thinking about is, oh my God, I hope my software doesn't break. I couldn't eat pretty much the entire day. And it's interesting, as the data starts arriving from Mars, it takes a pretty circuitous route, by the way. It goes through the typically a relaying orbiter around Mars. It then travels to the Deep Space Network, which is a network of antennas around the Earth, which then packetize that data and send it over to JPL. It goes through a series of processing steps to make it ready to be loaded in a piece of software like the one I had written. As that data is making its way to us, you can hear it. What I mean by that is you can hear in the building where different teams are who are part of that processing pipeline screaming. You hear the room where the guys who recognize that the Deep Space Network is tracking, they shout. You hear the guys that are receiving the first bits from the Deep Space Network, they're cheering. And then the guys who make the data products, they're cheering. And then the data arrives on our screen, and the room explodes. All the knots untie in my stomach instantaneously. And we see this, which has become one of the most important pictures to me of my entire life. This is the first high-resolution picture that we saw from Spirit, the first of the two rovers that landed, of Gusev Crater. What you're actually looking at is the mast of the rover lying down on its deck, and you're looking down the side of that mast out on the surface of Mars in the distance. It launched a journey, began a journey there that lasted for that rover 8 years, for the Well, 7 years, sorry. And for the other rover, we just passed, the Opportunity rover, we just passed the 9-year anniversary. And lest we forget poor Opportunity in the shadow of the amazing Curiosity, which I then went on to spend 6 years of my life working on, Opportunity will always have a really special place in my heart as the first mission that I worked on that landed successfully. So when I look back at Mars Polar Lander and the failure we suffered there, and then the successes that followed, I feel like I learned a lot there about the unavoidable nature of risk in hard things, the unavoidable nature of risk in any major enterprise, in your business. The need, however, to understand it and embrace it, not to run away from it, but to study it, analyze it, and make a science of it. And I bet you we would have a lot to talk about in that particular area, because we trade risk at NASA like it's a currency, like money, like fuel, like battery voltage, like every other currency that we have on our spacecraft. Risk is not something that you avoid at all costs. It simply has a cost, one that you have to manage. Now, I'm going to conclude here with just a couple of quotes that from those two rather impressive gentlemen that we heard a little bit about today, that I think are also pertinent for a gathering like this one. Because I think that coming together in places like this grants an opportunity to do what Alexander Graham Bell is saying right up there, which is that you spend so much of your life doing the next likely thing, right? The evolutionary step, the multiple telegraph to the telegraph, that you have to take opportunities like this one to learn something completely different, to embrace new ideas. So I encourage you at a gathering like this to listen to your presenters, to talk to each other, to try to leave the beaten path, to try to find something that surprises you and that could change fundamentally the way that you're working. And I would really love to hear about some of the things you bring back from that journey. Thank you very much for your attention.